Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for our discussion, Understanding Neurodiversity in the Workplace. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be exploring what it means to be neurodiverse, the challenges that neurodivergent people face in the workplace very often, and what employers and colleagues can do to make that working environment much more welcoming and inclusive. Joining me today are guests who are themselves neurodivergent and have built successful careers and who really want to help us open up this conversation. Angela Prentner-Smith will be joining us shortly. She's the Managing Director of Consultancy, Training and Technology Business, This Is Milk. She was diagnosed with dyspraxia at the age of 27, so quite late on in her young life, and has developed technology that encourages people to learn in whatever way works best for them. She writes regularly about neurodiversity in the national newspapers in Scotland, where she's based. And Michael Barton is joining us from Bristol, where he's a data analyst for a large motoring organisation. Michael has autism himself and is a published author, having written 3 books on the subject. And he's also a well-known public speaker on the benefits of being on the autistic spectrum and the benefits that that obviously brings to the workplace. As always with these discussions, if you do have a question for our guests, do please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. We are recording this conversation and we'll share that with you afterwards. As I say, Angela is going to be joining us very, very shortly. Michael, delighted that you're here at the moment for us. And I was going to start with you, Michael. I wonder if you can just explain your background, sort of when and how were you diagnosed with autism, and how that sort of played out through your childhood and into your working life?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. So I guess this is the chance for me to give a brief life story. In a sense, I'm not that old, but well, here we go. So I initially got my first diagnosis aged 2 of PDD-NOS, which stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. But what you shouldn't just really need to know about that condition is it certainly at the time it was quite a vague condition and basically meant that I wasn't developing in a typical fashion. Now, I think the main reason I received this diagnosis was because I was non-verbal until I was 3 years old, which the kind of thing is very common with autistic people. So I was receiving support, well, throughout my childhood, and it was age 7 that I was diagnosed as being autistic. They actually said, well, use strategies for Asperger's syndrome because, well, there isn't that much difference between autism and Asperger's syndrome. But anyway, that's a more in-depth conversation for another time. So I was receiving support throughout my time at school, one-to-one support with a TA, and yeah, throughout my time at school. Now, one of the main things that, well, you need to know when it comes to autistic children, I mean, autism, if you take a dictionary definition, is that it's defined by the deficits people display when interacting with others. So social situations and social skills and social communication are all things that autistic people find difficult. Now, the one thing that I would say is that, well, autistic children need to be explicitly taught the social skills that most people take for granted, which, I mean, when we're by ourselves doing our own thing, it's not a problem. But because humans are very sociable and we live in a very social world, well, these issues that autistic people face can come about on a day-to-day basis, and we often find it difficult to fit in. I mean, a very brief analogy is that it's like being a foreigner in your home country. But as I've got older, I've found myself more able to put myself in situations where I'm able to use more of my strengths. I mean, for example, being autistic means I have a very keen attention to detail and an extremely logical way of thinking. I always like to be very precise and accurate with my work. And yeah, if I find a subject that I'm very interested in, I want to learn everything there is to know about that specific topic in what are sometimes called special interests. So moving on from school, I went into university to study a degree in physics. Now, this certainly suited me better because, well, I didn't want to be studying subjects like English, which I found difficult anyway, but it was still beneficial to receive support from the additional learning support department in things like revision and note taking, and just that kind of self-organization that autistic people can find difficult. Now, moving on to work, because we're talking about the workplace, I mean, once I'd graduated and finished my degree, it actually took me 4 months of full-time job hunting to find a position. I mean, anyone who's applied for a job recently will know that it's not easy, but one of the biggest barriers that autistic people face is the interview process in itself, because rather than focusing on the skills that are required for the job, it's very common for people in interviews to ask vague, open-ended questions such as, tell me about yourself, or where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Now, I tend to not like open-ended questions because, well, I don't really know how to answer them. It's more thinking, what do they actually want me to say? And also in an interview process, surely the whole point of it is judging how good another person is at doing the job, not how good they are at talking about the job. Because, I mean, it's one thing to get along with someone and want to go to the pub with them, but that doesn't necessarily indicate how well somebody will perform at actually doing their job. So having been hired as a data analyst, I've been pretty much in continuous full-time employment now for the past 7 years, with my career continuing to progress. And that brings me to where we are today.
Well, that's very comprehensive, Michael, and thank you for explaining all that. And I guess that's really what we want to talk about today, is that workplace experience and the challenges that you face in terms of how your autism impacts both how you do your own work, how your employer communicates with you and structures your workload and your working day. So I wonder, you've talked about the recruitment process, and we'll maybe come back to that a little bit later, but just in terms of your day-to-day work, lots of us work in busy offices. Lots of us are also, sat at home or hybrid working or remote working at the moment. What works best for you in terms of the way that your work could be structured as somebody who has autism?
Well, being autistic, one of the things that means is that routine is very important to me. So, knowing what I'm going to do and when I'm going to do it. I mean, as a child, for example, I'd have a routine printed out and stuck to the fridge so that I knew what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. So it was just a way of, helping me to organize my brain. And it's actually quite reassuring just to have that kind of structure in place. And similarly, in the workplace, when I receive a new task, it's very helpful to know, exactly what I need to do, why I need to do it, and any kind of deadlines or any information around the task or tasks that I am expected to do in the workplace. But one thing I will add is that working as an analyst is very much suited to my logical and analytical way of thinking. So if anything, the weaknesses of being autistic and the support I need isn't as comprehensive as would be needed when I was at school. And there's also the fact that as an adult, I have learned how to deal with the world a bit better. But it is still important to note that autistic people often need support in the workplace. And I would say, having a career that's suited to that particular autistic person's way of thinking is a lot more important to us, and as well as making sure that any reasonable adjustments are put into place.
And so when you say that support is needed, what type of support would be useful for you?
So I think the main thing that's actually helped me, which something that was not put into place as a reasonable adjustment, it was just a piece of software that people use anyway, was a system called JIRA, which is common with data teams and software developers and programmers and whatnot, which is essentially a glorified to-do list. So I discussed with the rest of the team the tasks that I need to do, when they need to be done, and the order in which I need to do them, or their priority, and it's all laid out in a very clear fashion. And with each individual task or ticket, as it's called. There's a comprehensive list of information and resources and everything that's required, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows what's required from the ticket. Firstly, for me to be able to do the task, and secondly, for the stakeholders, so they know what to expect from that particular task, and so that they can't dynamically change information about it without at least consulting me first. So this has been really helpful for me, and having an agile way of working, which the word agile does have its own connotations, by the way. It doesn't necessarily mean flexible or dynamic as we know it. But what that means is that having this structure, having this framework in place, which, as I said, was not just a reasonable adjustment for me, it's something that just works, and it's the way that data teams and programming teams often work, which I have coincidentally found very beneficial for myself. But it means that just, yeah, to repeat myself, everybody's on the same page, everybody knows what's expected, so I can just put my head down and focus on the work without having to worry about any other distractions.
And in a way, that JIRA system is obviously suited to somebody who's working in a data team anyway, presumably, and dealing with a lot of technology and figures. But for somebody maybe who's in a different type of role in an organization, Michael, who has autism, who doesn't have access to a system like that, how important is it for their team leader to also communicate with them and give them tasks in a much more structured way than perhaps they might do with other members of the team who are not neurodiverse?
I would certainly say for autistic people, it is of paramount importance. I mean, autism is a condition where our communication skills aren't at the same level as that of neurotypical people. One thing that means is that it's a two-way system. Like, we find it more difficult to communicate with neurotypical people, that we already know about autism, but like I said, it's a two-way system. So neurotypical people need to adapt their communication style so that they can communicate better with us, and having some sort of system where the structures and procedures that we need are in place, whether you use JIRA or any other kind of software, is hugely important.
And what about the team dynamics then, and the relationships, those social relationships that you have at work? Because that must be quite a challenge by the sounds of it. I mean, you've said that, you know, you've learned over the years, and your communication skills certainly here are fantastic. You know, you're here on a webinar with us talking very, very, very comfortably. But, you know, within a workforce, there are different teams, there are different dynamics in an office environment, different dynamics when you're trying to communicate with somebody in a team like we are virtually. Can you sort of give us any advice around that, and how those sort of how you are able to build social relationships with other members in your team? That must be a challenge.
I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that it is a challenge, even though, well, I've been working on my social skills pretty much for my whole life, and it continued to develop them. I mean, I like to think of it as a hard skill that I need to continually work on and develop, rather than a soft skill where it's something that you're just naturally good at. I mean, I guess in a sense, being an analyst, because that has a lot of parallels with my way of thinking, people don't necessarily expect people that are analysts and computer geeks to be the most outgoing and the most sociable people. But at the same time, like I said, it's that two-way challenge. It's one thing for autistic people to learn to fit into a neurotypical world, but it's equally as important that other people are aware that I often have a different communication style, a different way of thinking and approaching social situations compared to other people. So things like going to the pub after work, can you have engaging in small talk around the coffee table, or even just a social chit chat, which some people would argue is very important for going up the career ladder, are things that, yeah, I will openly admit I find them difficult.
And that's an interesting one, because, you know, previously when we were all, you know, pretty much continually in an office, there are things crop up like a team building session, you know, or you've got a big long meeting with lots of people in a room that you've maybe not met before. I know Angela, unfortunately, is not able to join us just at the moment, but I know one of the things that Angela has talked to me about previously was, even setting up a room in an office when you're having a team meeting, the dynamics of how that is set up, can be difficult for somebody who is neurodiverse. Can you sort of shed some light on that, Michael?
Yeah, my understanding is that neurotypical people, for the most part, are pretty comfortable in situations with other people. So, I mean, the whole world is built around the neurotypical way of thinking. So we've got people coming into an office, they're very happy to chat with other people, make some small talk, have a coffee with someone else, and be able to do their work alongside that. But certainly the autistic way of thinking, definitely in my case, I mean, I'd say that's one of the benefits of working remotely. It's not just not having to commute on a day-to-day basis, but I am much more able to just get my head down and focus on my work so that I can be just that much more productive. Because, I mean, certainly when your train of thought is set on a particular direction, you just want to be able to get on with the task in hand. And having other people approaching me, asking me questions, just throwing you out from when you're concentrating on a difficult task. I mean, that's something anybody finds difficult, and that's a parallel I'll certainly be drawing quite a bit. But for autistic people, as I said, we've got that extra stress of being in an environment which is not natural for us, even though autistic people, especially autistic adults, often mask or camouflage some of their difficulties and almost force themselves to fit in to this neurotypical social culture, only for that stress to build up over time and be released either at home or long term or whatever the consequences may be. So yeah, just having those differences does mean that the workplace, just being in the workplace, let alone doing work, is that much harder. And it's something that I think is really important for other people to understand. Like, our brains are wired differently to yours, so just don't take these things for granted.
Yeah. So what does a good working environment for you look like, and what does a bad one look like?
Another open-ended question. Well, let's see how. Fine, I'll answer it.
How would I put, actually, just Michael, how would I put that question better for you?
So certainly in my case, more closed questions with a more like limited set of possible answers is better, and I'm able to answer them better rather than something which could have a load of different possible answers, because I don't know if the answer I'm going to give is going to be a good one or if I've gone completely off on a completely different tangent. And it's like, well, that's not really what I was looking for in the first place.
Yeah. So perhaps could I rephrase it and say, what would you recommend that an employer or a team manager, let's say a team manager that's managing somebody like yourself who's neurodiverse, what practical things can they do to help you in the workplace, in your job?
I mean, one thing that
Is
was
that any better?
It is a bit better, yeah. I appreciate the thought you're putting into it, but some of the things I would certainly help is, well, any kind of like team building or going to the pub should not be forced on autistic people. That's not to say we shouldn't be invited to these things, but it's the kind of thing that it would really help if it's planned out in advance. Like, any autistic people don't like unexpected change. If you give us some time to process it and try to rearrange our internal schedules around it, then we can make it work. That's assuming we want to do it. But as I said, like having a spontaneous team lunch or team building, it's just, well, I usually spend my lunch break alone. Like, I go out for a walk, I'm not thinking about work, I get some food, eat my food, maybe walk a bit more and go back to work. That was my schedule when I was working Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 in the office, just to, well, have a bit of time to myself. My idea of a lunch isn't to be social with other people, catch up on the office social chit chat, which I'm not interested in, by the way. And even things like, once I finish work, asking me to go to the pub. I mean, I like going to the pub. Many people like going to the pub, autistic or not. But having a bit of notice for that is important, because I've already got plans in my mind for the evening, and unless I don't have anything on, then the idea of being asked to go to the pub is a bit like, oh, I want to join in. I want to, like, sometimes I want to be with my colleagues, sometimes I don't want to be with my colleagues, but having to make that decision so quickly is just, oh, it can be a bit overwhelming for autistic people.
And so advance warning is important there as well, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Advance warning, so that we can like rearrange things in our mind and plan things. And it's not just let me talk to my girlfriend to see if they're okay with me staying later at the pub. It's just, well, giving me time to plan all of my other things that I've organized in my brain around any kind of changes.
It just occurred to me there, in terms of projects and work that you do, deadlines for work can change, can't they, quite often?
Yeah.
Is that a problem when that happens for you? And how do you manage that?
I mean, this is one of the benefits of having a system like JIRA, because if a deadline changes, I mean, the first thing you should do is let us know as soon as possible. But for JIRA, at least there can be justification and communication within the ticket, so that if one ticket gets bumped up above another, at least there is justification for that. So the stakeholder for the ticket, which gets bumped down, at least is able to receive that justification from managers or directors or whatever level above is required. It's just so that the communication is all there in one place, so that I'm not being bugged by numerous different people saying, well, what about this work that's important to me? What about this other work that's important to me? Like, this is the system we have. This is the way it is in JIRA. Like, that's the commander at the end of the day. That's the system which everybody goes by. And obviously, if something else comes along, well, all of the stakeholders need to be understanding of that. I will get to your work as soon as I can, but if something else takes priority, at least that's there in JIRA. There is communication there, and someone else can do the talking for me.
And that comes down to communication as well. And as we all know, a lot of us are bombarded by emails or Teams or Zoom meetings. There are numerous ways that people and organizations communicate now with people. How difficult is that for you? Are you saying here, Michael, that understanding one main method of communication is the thing that you need as somebody who is autistic, that you don't want 3 different ways to communicate with you at work?
I mean, it would be ideal to have one system of communicating, yes, but in the real world, we're not necessarily going to have that one system. But I think what's important is to understand the different systems, like using JIRA as one system, using Microsoft Teams or Slack or another instant messaging app, and as well being in the actual physical office, having other people potentially coming to talk to you. I mean, one reasonable adjustment that I would suggest is like using focus time, as it's sometimes called, just having time where I need to get my head down, I need to work, and other people are not allowed to come and distract me. And that kind of thing that needs to be respected by everybody, no matter how senior they are, is something that would be very important, and I think it's really beneficial for me, just so that I know I've got this 1 or 2 hour block or however long it is, so that I can just focus on and do my work, and I know that I won't be distracted. Because one of the things that other people often worry about is, it's one thing for me to focus on work, but I could be disturbed at any moment in time, and I need to be prepared for that. But what if I want to dedicate an hour or 2 to a specific task? I need to have that time to myself. So like I said, it's this whole 2-way communication. It's not just autistic people having to try to, well, putting a square peg into a round hole. Or is it a round peg into a square hole? I can't remember, but you know the expression that I mean. It's other people understanding us and respecting our way of thinking and preferences as well.
Yeah. Let's go back to the recruitment process, because I was quite interested to look at that in a bit more detail with you. Do you disclose that you're neurodiverse in the recruitment process? Is that something that people should be doing so that a potential employer can understand and make those reasonable adjustments as you describe them? Or is that something that a lot of people who are neurodiverse don't disclose, and then when they get into the workplace face challenges that they didn't realize might exist, and the employer, from the employer perspective, they also didn't realize?
So disclosure is a very personal choice. It's up to the individual to decide whether they disclose or not. But on the other hand, if you do decide to disclose, the employer is obliged by law to make reasonable adjustments for the candidate. So what I did, I disclosed on my CV that I was autistic, but I portrayed it in a very positive light with all of the beneficial traits, such as my attention to detail, logical way of thinking, out of the box thinking, just determination, perseverance, and being less likely to be distracted by small talk, as well as the numerous other benefits of being autistic. And I was saying that these skills, which I have very much aligned to my way of thinking, are the exact skills which are required to be a data analyst. And it's also linking well to the fact that I give talks as a side gig, and that I've got 3 books published, and well, that gives extra qualification to, well, I am autistic, so these are definitely going to be good books. But yeah, very much been open with it, but portrayed it in a very positive light. And one thing that I have seen in certainly all the interviews that I've got jobs for is it's not just having the typical interview process with vague open-ended questions, which there are resources out there for autistic people, so that you can say, they ask this question, this is what they actually want you to say. I mean, that's just general interview prep. But another thing I've had in every interview that has been successful is a practical task. It's one thing for me to talk about how good I am at a job, but well, you need to actually give autistic people the chance to prove that we actually do have a good attention to detail, and we actually are suited to the job based on a practical task. And that's where I think we can really excel.
So how do we overall look at the stigma that there has been around neurodiversity, particularly when it comes to employing people? How do we help remove that? Obviously, conversations like this help Michael hugely, and thank you again for joining us today. But what else can we do to remove that stigma?
I think the main thing that we can do to reduce stigma is education, increasing knowledge, because, well, they say education is the most powerful tool the world has to offer. So just educating yourself about things that you don't know, because one of the main reasons stigma comes about is because of that unfamiliarity, that uncertainty. Oh, this person's not like us, so I'm going to be cautious about them, which from a survival point of view is understandable. But we live in the modern world now. We're not fighting for our survival, so we need to overcome these instincts and just, well, learn more about neurodiversity. And to also, the second point I would add is to be open-minded. Like, yes, this person is not like me, they're not like everybody else, but in the technological age that we live in a very dynamic environment. So surely we need to embrace change. We need to embrace another person's different strengths and different abilities and different points of view. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be successful as a company if you've got everybody thinking in the same way with the same thought processes. You can't have the same person copy and pasted across an entire organization, because you don't have that cognitive diversity that is required for a company to innovate and be successful.
So it sounds like it's quite important, if there is, if your company is big enough or organization is big enough, to have a committee that comes together, a group of people that comes together to, help plan the future, whether that's the actual physical working environment or the work that you're going to be doing, to have representation on that body from somebody like yourself.
I absolutely agree. Nothing about us without us. It's one thing in the past, certainly neurotypical people generally have done a lot to try to help autistic people, but we know there are a lot of autistic people out there. Anywhere between 2 and 4% of the population is autistic. So anything involving autism or any other kind of neurodiversity needs to have people with lived experience to help with that consulting.
And actually, that feeds nicely into a question from Adam. Thank you for your question, Adam, who's just asking, does your employer use your lived experience to open opportunities for more neurodivergent candidates like yourself? Has that been your experience?
I mean, I'll be very surprised if an organization isn't learning from the insights that I can bring. I mean, I don't explicitly know as such, because unlike the gender pay gap, for example, we can tell how many men and women are employed by a particular company, but you can't say the same about neurodiversity, because there simply isn't enough data there, because we don't know how many people are neurodivergent. I mean, estimates suggest that around 1 in 7, but many people still do not feel comfortable disclosing their diagnoses, and I don't blame them, to be honest.
Yeah, so there's still challenges in the workforce, and actually, you know, one of the things there is that, you know, as you say, the figures aren't clear, and probably there are more people who, like Angela, if she joined us, are actually diagnosed quite late in life, and so they might not know that they are actually neurodivergent when they start out in the workplace, and might be facing challenges that they don't really understand why they have those challenges, because they haven't had the diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, later diagnosis is becoming increasingly more common, especially for women, I would add. And yeah, I mean, diagnosis in any kind of form, I think, should be seen as an entirely positive thing. Having a diagnosis helps a person to understand who they are and how they think and process the world. So any kind of diagnosis, in my opinion, should not be reacted to with stigma, as is all too common nowadays, but it should be like, this is a way to try to help understand another person. And one of the reasons companies employ other people is to, well, it's a mutually beneficial system. Like, I'm being paid thousands of pounds a year in order to provide the company with insights and analytics, and well, everybody's paid thousands of pounds a year by their company to provide work. So why wouldn't we make small changes and reasonable adjustments to maximize not only our health and well-being, but maximize what we can give back to a company?
Let's take Gavin's question here. Gavin, thank you very much for your question. Is there any advice that you can give to someone who is going through an adult diagnosis where the guidance in the workplace isn't clear? And I guess that happens to a lot of people at the moment.
I mean, if you feel comfortable discussing a potential diagnosis with your manager or anyone in the company, then by all means do so, because I mean, having that form of communication, having that awareness, provided you feel your manager or whoever is sufficiently understanding, is important. But obviously diagnosis can be a long journey for anybody. I mean, being diagnosed as autistic, for example, can take a number of years because of the waiting lists. So one thing that I've certainly advocated for is self-diagnosis, where I say, I'm pretty sure I am autistic, and well, you tell people that you are autistic because you feel that is how your brain works. So I think it's just overall having that collective, well, awareness and understanding, and just accommodating other people as well. As I said, we are human at the end of the day, so we just need to show the empathy that people are known for.
I don't know Gavin's situation, but Gavin, there is advice, I know, on websites like the ACAS website, some of the union websites, and there is an organisation called Neurodiversity in Business, where there might be some more specific guidance. I'm guessing that from Gavin's question that he's saying that actually in the workplace, there's not always, you know, an HR team that's set up to deal with this sort of thing. So independently, is there somewhere else that you could maybe go for advice? Michael, I don't know if you've got any recommendations on that.
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for all your insight today, Michael. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I guess we can just maybe finish by, you know, the benefits of neurodiversity in the workplace. You know, you've mentioned the fantastic skills and concentration that you have, and the focus on detail and the love of structure. there are so many people that we know who actually end up being entrepreneurs, which is interesting because entrepreneurship is, by its very nature, very changeable, isn't it? But what would you say are the benefits of having people who are neurodiverse in an organisation, Michael?
Well, I mean, that in itself can be an hours-long lecture. I could talk today about the benefits of neurodiversity in the workplace, but essentially, let's look at it a different way. If you didn't have neurodiversity, if you didn't have that cognitive diversity, people with different brains, different ways of thinking and points of view, it's going to be very dull because, well, you need people that think differently to bring new ideas and intellectual stimulation to the proverbial table. But also, if everybody thinks the same and is very like rigid in their way of thinking and company, this is what we do around here, well, that company before long won't be able to grow, for starters, and secondly, it won't be long before society changes, and if they're stuck in their ways, it won't be long before they go bust. So it's not just a nice to have. I'd say it's absolutely vital to harness neurodiversity and the power that neurodivergent people have, because, well, without it, I don't see how a company can survive in the long term.
Well, the founder of one company that is surviving very much because of that approach is This Is Milk, which is the brainchild of Angela Prentner-Smith. Angela couldn't join Michael and I a little bit earlier. Unfortunately, a fire alarm meant that you were chucked out of your office, Angela, and desperately trying to get in, but we're delighted to have caught up with you a little bit later on. Angela, Michael was explaining that he thinks embracing neurodiversity really as an employer is an absolute must for the future. I'm assuming that's what you would say as well as an employer who herself is neurodiverse.
Yes, I think it's a bit more than embracing it. I think you almost have to just take it as read that you have neurodivergent employees, even if you don't know it, right? So it's kind of assume that you have a neurodiverse workforce, because of course neurodiversity takes in everybody, and it takes all kinds of, flavors of brains, right? So you have to first just assume that it's there. Many people have not been diagnosed, or maybe do not, even people who have not been diagnosed and have certain conditions, they may not even be aware of it, depending on where they are in a kind of, their own journey of self-discovery. I didn't know about dyspraxia until I was 27 years old. I had never even heard of it. But I am now diagnosed dyspraxic. However, I went through 10 years of working without that diagnosis. There will be many, many other employees in your workplace just like that. So firstly, assume that you already are, and then explore whether the workplace that you've created is one that is a place that allows different brains to show their strengths, right? And allows for differences in ways of working, and allows for all the beauty of neurodiversity, as well as some of the adjustments that may or may not be possible in your work environment, right?
Yeah. When you look back then on those years that you were working, you hadn't been diagnosed, and you compare them with having the knowledge that you have dyspraxia, what would be the difference that you would have made to your early working days? What would you have wanted your employer to do at that stage if they had known that you were dyspraxic then?
There's two areas that, from a working life perspective, I feel have been most important for me to address in relation to dyspraxia. The first one's to do with time management. So my brain does not look at time the same way that a neurotypical person's does. And I really struggle with dates and times and scheduling. And that's typical of a number of neurodivergences, not just dyspraxia. But for me, that was really quite pronounced in the workplace. And where it became the most difficult was where I was managing a workplace and a job, as well as doing a voluntary role, as well as doing a postgraduate course. Knowing that I had dyspraxia meant I was able to go to my work and say, I actually need to be able to somehow look at these diaries holistically, and I need to be able to look at this stuff on the go. I check my diary possibly 30 times a day, and that seems ridiculous, but it is. It's like a comfort blanket to me because I can't retain dates, times, schedules in my head in the same way that you might expect. So knowing that, and knowing that it was something that actually was a challenge for me because of the way my brain works, was helpful for me to have that conversation. But it was also helpful for me to forgive myself a little bit that was a difficulty. The other place that I think has been most important from a workplace perspective is social situations. And again, it's twofold. It's one, being able to communicate that this is a particular challenge for me. And secondly, putting in sort of wraparound care for myself. So for me, going to new places with lots of people and new furniture and new surroundings can be really difficult. So if you think of going into, say, a conference, and if it's a conference space I've never been to before, there's furniture and there's people everywhere. My brain is working overtime to try and navigate through all of that stuff, that physical place stuff, because dyspraxia is almost a little bit like body dyslexia. It's like you don't quite fit in the world. You don't quite, your perception's a little bit off. You know, your left and right doesn't quite make sense. So all of that can be quite difficult. And on top of that, some common things that are common across all neurodivergences, such as increased social anxiety, sensory processing disorder. So I'm just more sensitive to noise. My social battery can be zapped really quickly because dyspraxia also has an element of social symptoms, so to speak, or social, I don't even want to call them symptoms, but just things that are different about how we do, which are quite close to autism. So that situation of being in a conference all day or in a team away day or something like that takes much more out of me than it would out of a neurotypical person. So knowing that, being able to communicate it and kind of adjust for it and say, I'm actually just going to need to have a quiet day tomorrow. I'm going to need to work from home. I'm going to need to kind of like shut the world off a little bit because I need to recover from that day is quite important. A huge part of diagnosis, though, for me was about self-understanding. You know, there is only so far the rest of the world can adjust itself for you, but you being able to accept that there's parts of yourself that actually, that's just the way you came. There's nothing you can do about it. And you can adjust for it and you can accommodate for yourself was really important. You know, forgiving yourself for the fact that you're never going to be able to do aerobics or line dancing. Like that's, you know, it's not that I haven't worked as hard. In fact, I've worked harder to do these things. I'm just not cut out that way. It took me 9 times to pass my driving test, but I did it. I've never been in an accident. I'm a good driver now, but it's a little bit, again, like a dyslexic learning to read. You just have to put more effort into it. I can do it, but it took an awful lot longer for me because that part of my brain just works differently. And that's the reality of it.
So as you became an employer yourself and moved to actually manage people, you deliberately actively employ people like yourself who are neurodiverse, I believe.
Yeah.
Is that right? And how do you manage them when you're managing yourself as well?
So it's been a happy accident, I suppose. When I started the company, I mean, we've been through various rounds of kind of who the team are, and this is milk. But the team that we have now is roughly about half knowingly neurodivergent. There may well be more, but we don't know, right? It's not been diagnosed. So I can certainly make some guesses, but we're sitting roughly at about the 50% mark. When I say that was a happy accident, I think because of the way we promote ourselves, and we are a bit different, we are a bit quirky, we're an impact brand, you know, the work that we're doing is around equalities, it's around learning, it's around changing workplace culture, just to generally be more acceptant, more human-centered and more inclusive. I think that's naturally attracted people whose brains are you know, attracted to that. So even before we started talking about neurodiversity, we were all, you know, we already had that kind of attraction to us, or that kind of brand to it. There are some things that we're now actively doing around attracting, and not just neurodivergence, we're, you know, just to attract different people, right? Because diversity is good, such as making it clear what the interview process is going to be up front, you know, reviewing our job descriptions from an equalities perspective, making sure that we aren't, you know, including things in there like, let's say, great people skills, when actually the job doesn't really require you to have great people skills. You know, just being very careful about things like that, because that could put off, you know, for example, people with autism. That kind of thing, making sure that when we're interviewing for the right things. So we're not judging people on whether or not they can make eye contact. Again, that's something that someone with autism will find difficult, but it doesn't necessarily mean they can't do the job. So there are some things now that we have put in place that means that we are screening for the right things rather than screening out based on social convention.
Yeah.
The second part of that, I think, is about managing it, was what your question. Yeah. So managing, managing diversity, I'll be frank, it's tough. It is really tough. At the heart of it, though, it's about creating an environment of psychological safety where people can feel they can be themselves and they can openly have these conversations. I'll be honest, I didn't disclose my dyspraxia once. So my dyspraxia was diagnosed while I was working at Student Loans Company. I did disclose to them because it was part and parcel of what I was doing. I was doing a postgrad at the same time as working, and I got my diagnosis and was able to go to them and say, these are all the adjustments that I need. And a lot of them were fairly simple. Now, I didn't disclose it though after that because I was afraid of prejudice. Yeah, truthfully. So being clear that you aren't going to be prejudiced if people disclose this is really important. I think the tides are starting to turn on that, and us having this conversation today is part of that discourse, right? It's that changing perceptions of what it actually means to have dyspraxia, dyslexia, autism, ADHD, whatever it happens to be. So being clear in not just in like, yeah, here's your statement, here's your equality statement. It has to be backed up by some action as well. So that's part of it. So, you know, creating a safe space for people to be able to disclose, but also creating a safe space within the workplace to actually say, I don't understand that, to say, this isn't working for me, to say, I'm going to struggle with that because is really important. And that's not easy. That's not like a one-step solution. I can't tell you, here's a magic wand. It's about, you know, intent-based leadership. It's about, creating a kind of network of followership, right? It's about providing safe spaces. There's lots and lots to this. I think where I've had a benefit is because I am dyspraxic, I can say in front of my team, I'm out, I'm not doing that because of this. So I've given everybody the opportunity to kind of, you know, raise their own flags. Being honest, one of the biggest difficulties I've found is where one person's needs don't align with another's, right? So if you've got two employees, one person needs chaos to perform, one needs routine and order, but you need them to work on a project together, that can be very difficult to manage. Whether or not that's specifically because of neurodivergence doesn't really matter. It's to do with, you know, that's a difficult situation and conflicts can arise. We've done a series of lunch and learns within the team spoken from a kind of lived experience perspective on dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, and autism, because truthfully, there have been conflicts arise from, miscommunications, mistuned social judgments, this kind of thing. But creating an environment where people can openly say, I am an autistic person, I am a dyspraxic person, or however they want to put that language around it, helps in having that conversation. So you can then flip that to, right, an example, someone is humming in a meeting. You're taking that as they're not listening to you. Put an autistic lens to that. No, they're stimming because they're trying to calm down their senses. An entirely different situation, just looking at it from those two different lenses. So I think all of that's quite important. What I've tried to steer clear of, or tried to talk about more, is the fact that people aren't boxes, right? You don't fit neatly into you're a dyslexic box, you're a dyspraxic box, you're an ADHD box, right? There's so much overlap with this, and there's things that actually you may not have, may not meet the diagnostic criteria for any of these things, but you may still have that particular challenge, right? So all of this, though, is just about creating a workplace where people can be themselves and they can feel safe in opening up about this stuff. And I think reducing stigma around any condition is so important, because the people that I employ and the people that I know, and basically like most of my family, most of my work colleagues, most of my friends, probably tick one of the boxes of neurodiversity, right? It'll be there. But they're also super intelligent, great conversationalists. There's lots and lots of benefits to it as well. And the way I see it is, they'll talk about a spiky profile. So with me, my spikes are in verbal comprehension, strategic thinking. I've got huge spikes, right? And then I've got real lows as well when it comes to perception, right? Like my perception of my environment and my processing speed. My processing speed is really low. But that doesn't mean that I'm not processing your words quickly. It's just to do with the physical side of it. So you have to be able to tap in to people's strengths, and you actually have to allow people mistakes. You have to let people fail. You have to let people own their flaws as well, because you don't get the best out of them unless you make it okay for their flaws too.
So just sort of finishing the conversation, Angela, that's all fantastic information. Is there kind of one sort of top tip that you would have for an employer, who maybe hasn't addressed this in their organization, never really thought about it, if they're trying to sort of champion neurodiversity in their workplace? What's the kind of overarching thing that you'd say to them at the moment?
That's a tough question. It's kind of a where do you start?
Yeah.
I would get somebody in to talk to them from a lived experience perspective. Someone like myself or Michael that was on earlier, have someone come in and speak to them, someone who is comfortable being open. I was going to say have an employee speak, but you don't know that they'd feel safe to do that. And how do you find them? And you don't want to create that kind of tokenistic, find us the only Black person in the company, or find us. Yeah. You don't want that. So I would have somebody come in and talk to you and talk to the team, and just start to open up these conversations, because people don't know what they don't know, right? Like that's the reality. And sometimes people make mistakes with the best of intentions. They're not doing it on purpose, but they could very well be silencing voices, and they could be assuming people are not capable when they are. They just haven't created the right environment for them.
Yeah. Angela, thank you so much. That answered a big one of the questions that we were asked earlier, was about using the lived experience to kind of explore this more in the workplace. So that's really hit the nail on the head. And actually that point about somebody independent coming in, that's actually quite interesting, because I don't think we'd actually thought about the fact that if it's somebody within your workforce, they're again possibly being labelled, which they might not be comfortable with, and that might lead to different conversations in the workplace about them. So that's actually a really, really interesting point you've made there. Listen, yeah, sorry, Angela, on you go. Yeah,
I was just going to say, I mean, it may well be that your workplace is safe enough, and you already have vocal advocates around this, and by all means tap into that. Yeah. But don't go searching for those people if they're not right in your face already, because that could, nobody wants to be put on a pedestal for, yeah. unless they're asking for it. I just don't think it's appropriate.
Yeah. Angela, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I really, really appreciate your input, specifically from that employer point of view as well. So thanks once again, and thanks to Michael for the chat that we had earlier as well. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you found this really, really interesting and full of insight. And if you are a client of Frog Systems, then we'll be posting this discussion on your ASHIA Wellbeing platform, and there's lots more content around the subject of neurodiversity and supporting neurodiverse employees on there. You can find out more about what we do to support people with their mind, body and relationships on our Wellbeing platform by visiting our website and following us on social media. Thanks once again to Angela and for Michael earlier for their fantastic conversation, and enjoy the rest of your day.